I welcome you all to the module 6 of the course titled Applied Positive Psychology. So the module 6 is about resilience and post-traumatic growth. So we'll be talking about these two concepts in this module. Today is lecture number 16 which talks about understanding and building resilience. So lecture 16 is about resilience and the different aspects associated with it. So I have divided this lecture number 16 into two parts. So now I'll be talking about part 1 of the lecture. So just to give you brief recap of the last lecture, that is lecture number 15, which was part of module 5. So in the last lecture we talked about the concept of successful aging in lecture number 15, and we discussed various aspects associated with it. What is the meaning of successful aging? What are the criteria to decide whether somebody has entered into successful aging category or not? We have discussed models of successful aging. We also discussed some of the classic studies in the context of successful aging, which shaped this whole area of research. We also discussed the concept of paradox of aging and happiness, that there is a concept of paradox in the aging literature, which basically means that as the age progresses or people enter into the later stages of their life, there is a significant cognitive and other physical decline that happens, but research shows that people generally in that stage also experience more happiness and emotional well-being. So that is considered as a kind of paradox of aging, and we have discussed how aging is related to happiness. We also discussed various processes involved in the successful aging in terms of by discussing certain models associated with the processes of successful aging, and at the end we discussed future directions to successful aging. So in today's lecture, that is lecture number 16 part 1, we'll be talking about the concept of resilience. How do we define resilience? What are the different perspectives to define resilience? We'll also look at 3 waves of research. What are the different waves of research that happened in the context of resilience? And at the end, we'll be talking about some of the foundational studies on resilience. So this will be covered in the part 1 of the lecture. So let's start today's lecture. So let us understand what is the meaning of resilience. How do we define resilience in the literature of psychology? Now, the concept of resilience, the word resilience basically comes from the Latin root called resilire, meaning to leap back or rebound effect, rebound. Yes, to come back to the original position. So that's rebounding effect. The term initially found its footing in ecology, referring to an ecosystem's capacity to recover or adapt in response to disruption. It has since taken on a broader psychological meaning. So initially this term was used in the context of ecological perspective, where it was used in the context of how an ecosystem recovers. Once certain disintegration happens in an ecosystem, that how that ecosystem responds to disruptions and comebacks. Now this term is obviously used in a more general psychological sense. Today, in a very general sense, resilience is described as a person's ability to bounce back from challenges or setbacks. So there are different definitions of resilience. We'll be talking about some of these things. So in a general sense, when we talk about resilience, we are talking about a person's ability to bounce back after certain significant trauma, challenges or setback happens in one's life. So when something negative happens in one's life, some negative event, challenges or setbacks, to what extent the person is able to bounce back, come back to the previous level of functioning, that determines the quality of resilience. If the person is quickly able to return back, that means that person's resilience is much higher. So that's the general idea of resilience. Let us see some of the more specific definitions that are available in the literature. So one definition says resilience is a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. So this definition says resilience is a process, it's a dynamic process which talks about one's ability to positively adapt to situations where there is a adversity involved in a situation. So whenever some adversity happens, to what extent the person is positively adapt to those situations determines that person's resilience. So resilience is characterized by good outcomes in spite of serious threats to adaptations or development. So resilience is an indicator which describes that the person is able to adapt positively, or there is a good outcomes in spite of serious threats to adaptation. So it's not easy to adapt. So there is challenging situation happens, and then instead of that challenging or difficult situation, the person is able to adapt positively. So that is what reflects resilience. So in these definitions, there are two important aspects to this definition of resilience. One is it is about exposure to significant threat or adversity. So we cannot talk about resilience in a general sense. Resilience is always discussed in the context of adversity, some traumatic event, or some significant threat happens in one's life. Resilience is always described in those contexts. We cannot talk about resilience in a general context of the life. So whenever there is an adversity happens, there is a significant threat or traumatic event happens. So this is one important aspect to resilience. So that has to be present. Then, so there is an achievement of positive adaptation outcome despite these threats. So despite those threats, if person is able to positively adapt to them, then it is called resilience. So there is the presence of disruptions in terms of traumatic event, challenges or threats, and there is a positive adaptation to such situation. These two important components determine the concept of resilience in terms of defining it. So these two are important things. Now when we talk about adversity, here adversity is used in a general sense. It refers to negative life events. So when we talk about adversity, we are talking about negative life events that is quantitatively associated with adjustment difficulties. So any life event which is negatively toned and which creates difficulties in one's life in terms of adjusting. So whenever any traumatic event happens, obviously it creates certain disruptions in one's life, and it is not easy to adjust to challenging situations or adversities in one's life. It creates certain difficulties in one's life. So those situations can be collectively called as adversity in general in the definition. Some researchers take a broader perspective, defining adversity as any experience of hardship. Whenever you face any experience of hardship or difficulties in life, they generally call it as an adversity, while others include both major life event and routine setbacks. Some other people talk about only in the context of some major life events when something happens which is negatively toned, or even in routine daily life certain setback happens. Resilience can also be discussed in those contexts. So adversity can be used loosely in all these contexts. So in the context of resilience, a positive adaptation means or outcome, it means it's traditionally seen as maintaining mental health and avoiding mental illness despite adversity. So this is generally used in outcome-based definition of resilience. So here basically when we talk about positive adaptation or outcomes, we are talking about that the person is able to maintain his positive mental health and is able to avoid mental illnesses despite this adversity is happening. So that's called positive adaptation. So these two components are very important when we define resilience. Now, if you look at the definitions of resilience in the literature, there are diverse conceptualizations. So this basic definition is common in all the definitions, but then how do this resilience is conceptualized differs from definition to definition. For example, some definition considers resilience as a trait. Some definition considers resilience as a process. Some definition considers resilience as an outcome. Some considers a broader conceptualization which encompasses all the ideas of trait, process and outcome. So if you look at literature, there will be definition which considers resilience as a trait, or some definition consider it as a process, some as an outcome, some as a combination of all these things. So we'll see some of these definitions and how they differ in their conceptualization. So in the context of trait and process-based definition of resilience, a positive adaptation or outcome involves recovering or maintaining one's previous level of functioning following adversity. So when we talk about positive adaptation, which is an important component of the definition, the trait-based definition, we'll talk about some of these things. Mostly they are saying you are able to maintain a positive adaptation in a situation only when you are able to bounce back to the previous level of functioning. Before the negative event happens, if you are able to go back to that stage, then you are able to, or you are able to maintain a positive adaptation. Now let us see some of the trait-based definition of resilience. Now, some of the definitions are listed here. One is, it's an adaptive stress-resistant personal quality. So when we talk about trait, we are talking about it's a personal quality of a person, characteristics of a person. So that's the trait. Trait always comes from the personality characteristics, something that is inherent within the person. So when we talk about somebody is a resilient person, from the trait-based perspective, we are saying that person is resilient by nature, by trait characteristics. So this characteristics of trait is within that person. So in general, the person is most of the time having resilient qualities. Some other definition includes the personal qualities that enable one to thrive in the face of adversity. Other definitions include a personal trait that helps individual cope with adversity and achieve good adjustment. So those basic two components are always there in all the definition, but when it is conceptualized as a trait, it is considered as a personal quality that is inherent in the person, which is relatively permanent. So thus it is clear that personal characteristics conceptualization of resilience are quite narrow in scope and centrally focus upon the inherent qualities of the person. So these trait-based definitions are narrow in a sense, it is only considered some personal characteristics only. So if somebody is resilient, that means this person has a resilient qualities within himself or herself. Nothing else is considered. So in that sense, it is a narrow conceptualization only in terms of personal characteristics. So these are called trait-based definition of resilience. Let us look at some process-based definition of resilience. So here, resilience is considered more as a process rather than just somebody's personal qualities. So these are broader in scope and recognize that resilience derives from a number of sources, not merely from personal attributes. In the trait-based definition, the resilience is only conceptualized as a personal characteristics. So the source of trait is personal quality or characteristics. In the process-based definition, the source of resilience comes from many other things apart from personal attributes. So personal attribute could be one reason why somebody is resilient or not resilient, but source of resilience can come from the environment also, from the task and so on, so many other things also involved in the context of the situation or context or the situation. One such definition which can be called as a process-based is resilience is a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of a significant adversity. So if you see the definition, other things remain same, only in trait it becomes a personal quality, in the process-based it becomes a dynamic process. So that's the difference only here. So these definitions or any other definition which conceptualizes resilience as a process emphasize that resilience is both a dynamic process and a context specific. So resilience can happen in context. It may not be very general thing as far as process-based definitions are concerned. They are always discussed in the context-wise or context-specific situations. So as a dynamic process, we are saying resilience involves ongoing change. So it's a dynamic process. Depending on interaction with the situation, resilience can change. Sometimes it becomes higher or lower depending on how you are interacting with the situation. So in that sense, it is called as a dynamic process or activity or progress. Being contextually based means that resilience is specific to a particular situation. An individual may show strong resilience in one area of life but not necessarily in another area of life. So basically what is saying, when we say it is context specific in the process based definition, means somebody may be highly resilient in one specific context or area of life. Let's say It could be in any work-life situation, the person shows a lot of resilience, but the person may not show same resilience in other contexts like, let's say, personal life and so on. It is possible. So resilience is always discussed from the context perspective or situation perspective. So that is how process-based definition conceptualizes is much broader than the trait-based definition. So here, it makes more sense that resilience is best understood as a dynamic, interactive process which functions across different systems and level. Resilience can come from different levels, different systems within which we all work. Hill et al. Defines resilience as the dynamic process by which a biopsychosocial system returns to a previous level of functioning following a perturbation or disturbance caused by the stressors. So, all the definitions are basically same. Here only it is considered as a dynamic process. Where this conceptualizes a more broader definition in a sense, it is saying the biopsychosocial system. So disruption can happen in biological system also, psychological system also, social system also. When some disturbances happens and the person is able to return back to the previous level of functioning in all these things, then we call it as a resilience, and this is a process-based definition. So these process-based perspectives of resilience emphasize its interactive nature involving interplay, as we have already seen. Additionally, resilience exists on a continuum. Here, in the process-based definition, resilience are seen as a continuum, meaning individual can display varying degree of resilience in different situations rather than being merely present or absence. So here, resilience is not considered as a binary concept that either resilience is present or absent. It is not conceptualized like that. It is conceptualized as a continuum. In the process context where resilience exists in a continuum means individuals may display high resilience, low resilience in different situations depending on so many other factors. So this is more of a continuum concept in the process-based definition. Trait-based may be more of a binary sense that it is either present or absent. So this is the basic definition of resilience. So resilience are mostly, most of the definitions and the research basically talks about resilience in terms of process-based definition because it is much more broader and it looks into the different factors which can influence resilience. Trait-based definitions are mostly, they are narrow in focus and sometimes people use them for some certain specific research. But process-based definitions are much more popular and much more used in the context of research because they give more insights about factors associated with person in the environment, in the context, and so on. Now let us look into the different research waves that happened. When we talk about waves of research, we are talking about a certain types of research emerges and then there is a shift happens and another types of research happens and shift happens, then there is another types of research, category of research emerges. So in that context, we are saying the different waves of research. So let us see in the field of resilience or in the area of resilience, what are the different waves of research that were evident historically. Now, resilience research began, more proper research began in 1970s. Initially focusing on children in poverty and neglect. Researchers observed that some children grew up and prospered despite the adversity while others languished. So some of the initial research in resilience started in the 1970s. The initial research were mostly focusing on the children who were born and brought up in difficult situations like poverty and neglect. So they were trying to see how these children are able to cope with such situation, and they found that actually within all this, despite all these difficulties faced by these children, some children actually grew up and prospered, and they become much stronger person, while obviously some other children they languished and could not prosper. So they were trying to understand all these differences, why this happens. Initially, these children were described as invulnerable. The children who prospered, despite all these problems in their life, they were described as invulnerable children, means they are less influenced by their situation. Initially, the resilience term was not used. as resilience was then viewed as an all or nothing quality. So initially it was considered either you have it or you don't have it. In that sense, it was used initially. Either it is present or absent. So invulnerable word was used in the initial research, some of the researches. Over time, research revealed that resilience is both relative and context specific, as we discussed in the process-based definition, which became much more popular later. That led to a shift away from the term invulnerable. So then invulnerable term was not used. Resilience became much more popular, and this term was used because the context of the use of the term changed and it became much broader. So invulnerable term was not used later. Now let us look at the first wave of research. So initial research, what was the pattern of those research? So that is called the first wave of research. So if you look at the first wave of resilience research, it focused on identifying the factors associated with the resilience by asking what questions. So initial research was focusing on understanding what factors are associated with the resilience. Which factors lead to high resilience and which factors which are protective factors for resilience and factors which are makes people more vulnerable and so on. So by asking what questions, what ingredients or what factors are responsible for resilience to happen. So those was in the first wave of research, this kind of questions were mostly addressed in the resilience research, where the focus was to find factors and the variables responsible for resilience. So researchers used two main methods. One is a person-focused approach, which compared resilient individuals to non-resilient ones in a similar situation. So person-focused approach research were basically making comparison between individuals who are highly resilient and individuals who are non-resilient in a comparable situation, and they are trying to see what made one group as resilient and one group as non-resilient. The other category of research were variable-focused approach or research, which examined relationship between individual and environmental characteristics that supported resilience outcome despite adversity. So other researches were variable focus research, where they were trying to understand the relationship between individual and the environment. So how this interaction is happening and what environmental characteristics were supporting resilient outcomes. What kind of environment were supporting to resilient individuals? So what kind of individual and environment interaction is leading to resilient outcomes despite all these difficulties faced by individuals? So focus was on identification of variables. In the person focus approach, the focus was more on identifying who are resilient, who are non-resilient, and then making comparison. So this kind of researches were evident or more prominent in the first wave of research. So this wave of research or initial research wave highlighted protective and promotive factors. What protects individual in terms of facilitating resilience, which were linked to resilience, spanning characteristics of the children. What kind of characteristics of those children who were studied initially led to high resilience, like their temperament, positive emotions, family, community, broader societal context. What things were necessary which led to the resilient individual and so on. Overall, this study created a comprehensive list of factors associated with resilience after exposure to adversity. So this study's initial wave of research actually, helped us to understand factors associated with resilience, and that was the major focus of the first wave of research. Some of this thing will look into some of the specific research that we will discuss in the upcoming slides. So that was the first wave of research. Second wave of research continued from the first wave of research. And the second wave of resilience research focused on understanding how these protective factors which were identified in the first wave associated with resilient outcome, identified in the first wave, could be developed and strengthened. Now in the first wave, the research identified the factors which are related to or promoting factors for resilience. The second wave of research focused on how to develop those factors. Since these are important factors, facilitative factors, promoting factors for resilience, which were identified in the first wave. The second waves were trying to understand how to promote them. Since these are important, how to strengthen them. So that was mostly the focus of second wave of research. So researchers began to explore how questions, how can we develop them? How can we facilitate them? The processes that fosters resilience and protect individual from risk and adversity. So this phase also aimed to clarify how the previously identified factors contribute to and interact ways that result in resilience. So that was the main focus of the second wave, how to strengthen, develop the factors identified in the first wave of research. So it was found that these resilient promoting factors operate effectively across both high and low risk environment, pointing to an inherent system that supports continuous development even amid challenges and adversities. So the second wave of research, a lot of this research actually indicated that a lot of these resilient promoting factors which were identified in the first wave, actually they are effective in a lot of different situations, including high risk situation or even low risk situations or environments when we face, which shows that these are like factors which can protect you whether your situation is difficult or even not so difficult. In different situations, they can promote your resilience in different situations also. So during this wave of research, during this time, second wave of research, several models were also developed in terms of how to strengthen those factors and what are the factors involved in it. I'll just discuss few models. One is called two-step model, proposed by Fletch, 1988, introduced a two-step model describing resilience as a process governed by law of disruption and reintegration. So this model says resilience can be actually conceptualized based on these two concepts. One is disruption and then reintegration. So once some negative event happens in one's life, there is a disruption happens. So everything falls apart. When something bad happens in one's life or negative event happens, at the psychological level, at the social level, so many changes happens which can be considered as a disruption which leads to trauma or stressful experiences. Then people reintegrate again, slowly they collect themselves and come back together and then start functioning. So the resilience is about disruption happens and then how do you reintegrate after that. So this model talks about these two concepts. According to this model, stress and adversity causes disruption. Negative events in life causes disruption in one's life, which individuals then manage through a process of reintegration. Then when they manage those disruptions, that is called reintegration. So that's called two-step model. Then comes the resiliency model. This resiliency model is an extension of this two-step model on the flex model. Building on that, Richardson and colleagues proposed resiliency model which elaborates on the law of disruption and integration proposed by Fleck in his earlier model. So Richardson resiliency theory is considered as a meta theory as it integrates elements from multiple theories to provide a comprehensive framework for understanding resilience. So resiliency model is much more elaborative, it is much more of a meta theory which integrates elements from diverse other theories to give a comprehensive framework to understand resilience. So it frames resilience as a process rather than fixed state. So this model is based on the process-based definition of resilience. It considers that resilience comes from diverse factors, not just individual characteristics, and underscores the potential for growth through adversity and the varied pathway people can take to life challenges, and what are the different possibilities that happens after facing difficulties and life challenges. So this theory talks about certain components. It's based on the idea that individuals continuously influenced by factors within the person, internal strength and external factors. So there is a continuous interaction between the personal characteristics, traits, as well as environmental factors. Now the key component of this model is obviously, as it is based on the earlier model, so they say there are two important things, factors which they maintain here. One is disruption, which is when an individual faces challenges or adverse event, it disrupts their usual functioning and stability. So the person's functioning disturbs. If something bad happens in one life, let's say death of someone, loved ones, it causes a lot of disruptions in our life. In terms of our functioning, we are not able to function properly for some time or few days. Our stability, changes, and we become unstable in a sense, emotionally disturbed, and so on. So that's called disruption. This disruption can be due to various forms of stress, whether minor daily challenges or more significant life-altering events. This disruption can happen when something very major event happens, like death of someone or loved one, or it can happen also in the daily life situations also, when certain challenges appears in daily life also. So once disruption happens, the individuals as a human beings, we try to reintegrate again, collect ourselves and function. So the next stage is called reintegration, which following disruptions, individuals engage in a process called reintegration, where they adapt, learn, and adjust to restore balance. So in the reintegration process, we restore our balance. Now this is about the earlier two-step model, but this model, resiliency model, expands this reintegration process and elaborates more on this reintegration process. So they say, this says when reintegration happens, there are many possibilities that can happen for an individual. When we reintegrate, it is not same for everybody. So there can be various types of reintegration that happens. So that is the addition of this model. First is there can be resilient reintegration. That means the individual adapts positively, growing stronger and gaining new skills and insight. So when disruption happens, some people can reintegrate under this category called resilient reintegration. If such reintegration happens, that means the person will adapt positively. They will adapt to it very, very positively, and they will not only adapt, they will become stronger and gain new skills and insights. So whenever negative event happens, which is very similar to post-traumatic growth that we discussed. When reintegration happens, or post-traumatic growth that we will be discussing in the coming lectures. It talks about here, we not only just adapt here in the resilient reintegration, we also grow out of it. We become some new skills also we develop after facing that. Second type of possibility is called homeostatic reintegration. In this case, the person returns to their previous baseline level of functioning without significant growth. So here the person just, after the disruption, they bounce back to their previous level of functioning. So they have not grown out of it, no new skills were developed, only they became the previous version of themselves, whatever before the event they were. So they will come back to the normal functioning of whatever functioning level they had. So that's called homeostatic reintegration. The third possibility is called reintegration with loss. Here, the response leads to negative coping mechanism, potentially worsening the individual's well-being. Here, the person is not able to reintegrate properly, so they are not able to cope with the situation. So, or if they are coping negatively with the situation. So these are not effectively coping mechanism. So it can worsen the situation of the individuals, so their well-being may decrease. Recovering with loss means that people give up some motivation, hope, or drive because of the demands from the life prompts. So what happens? There is some loss happens here. Person reintegrates, but after the reintegration, the person something has lost from the person. What is that loss? Loss could be loss of motivation in something. There may be loss of hope, or maybe loss of drive to do something. So after some negative event, the person becomes little bit, passive in that sense. And even though the person has reintegrated, but reintegration is not proper in that sense, because there is some sense of loss is always there. The person loses their motivation to do something, or they lose their hope and so on, because of some negative events in their life. So those will be called as reintegration with loss. And the fourth possibility is called dysfunctional reintegration. Here the individual struggles to cope, resulting in harmful behaviors or mental health challenges. Dysfunctional reintegration occurs when people resort to substances, destructive behaviors, or other means to deal with the life problems. Here it is like the person is actually not able to reintegrate. So there is a dysfunctional reintegration happens. The person, in order to reintegrate, the person resorts to some negative behavior or negative coping strategies, and such as taking substances, destructive behaviors, as a result of those negative events in their life. So they are not able to reintegrate and they become actually dysfunctional here. So with loss means the person will lose even because of they are not able to integrate properly, but reintegration is happening with certain loss, but loss in terms of like they may lose their motivation and hope in life. But in terms of dysfunctional reintegration, the person actually becomes dysfunctional in terms of they start engaging in harmful behaviors, and that may lead to mental health challenges and so on. So these are the four possibilities of reintegration in this model, which is shown in this diagrammatically here. So this is how they have shown it. So what is happening here? So some adversity of life event happens. So there is an impact. Obviously there will be some protective factors which may reduce those impact if people have protective factors. Then there are also biopsychological or spiritual homeostasis that people have. So whenever an impact of an event happens, so there may be so many layers to it that filters those impact. One is if there is an environmental protection in terms of some support system and so on. Then within the individual also there is some biopsycho-spiritual processes, whatever you have. They're also different for different individuals that may also protect or make people more vulnerable. Then obviously if the impact is not covered by them, then obviously the disruption happens. The disruptions, then once the disruption happens, then slowly the person try to reintegrate, because there's a tendency we want to adapt. We cannot keep remaining in that state. So that reintegration happens. Now this reintegration may be of four types, as we have already discussed. One is dysfunctional reintegration. Here it is the worst form of reintegration. The person become highly dysfunctional in this case. In the process of reintegration, they become dysfunctional. Then comes reintegration with loss. Here also the person is trying to reintegrate, but with certain sense of loss of motivation, hope and so on. Then in this homeostasis zone, the reintegration, the person reintegrates in a homeostatic sense. The person becomes the same person before the event they were. So they will go back to their previous version of themselves in terms of functioning. Here the last one is resilient reintegration is above the homeostasis. Person not only just moves back to the previous level, they also grow out of it. So some new additional skills and positive qualities develops within the person when they face these difficult situations of the life. Like the person may become much more psychologically strong, and while facing these difficulties, earlier their psychological strength was probably less. Now while facing these difficulties of their life, they might become much stronger. So that will be called as a resilient reintegration. So that's the model. Now the third wave of resilience research actually focused on understanding how resilience could be intentionally developed, especially in cases where it is not naturally occurring. So obviously the second wave also focused on developing those factors. Third wave mostly focused on how can we intentionally develop those factors, mostly in terms of interventions. When resilience may not occur automatically, you have to develop it intentionally. So they are focusing on this approach. So this shift did not imply that earlier research of resilience processes or protective factors was complete. So there was obviously the other researches that was there in the first wave, second wave, they were also continuing, but this is a new trend that also emerged in the third wave. So that this third wave aimed to translate findings from the first two waves into practical prevention and intervention strategies. So focus was on developing specific intervention strategies, so that at the individual level and collective level, we can enhance resilience among people, and especially people who are at high risk. The research began using interventions to promote positive adaptation in individuals identified as being high risk for adverse outcomes. So that was one of the major focus in the third wave. Initially, these interventions were largely theory driven, later evolving to include randomized control trials to greater effectiveness. So all kinds of interventions were studied, some were theory driven, some were more randomized control trials and so on. During this period, researchers considered questions such as whether exposure to risk or adversity was necessary for resilient building and the best timing for interventions and so on. So they were also focusing on when the intervention is most effective, at what stages of adversities and so on. So a lot of focus was given on intervention strategies. Researchers like Reuter and others found that resilience development often benefits from controlled exposure to adversity, suggesting that some level of risk may be necessary. So the interventions, what factors led to more effective intervention? Some of the findings are like when the benefits of resilience or the strategies were much higher, when the people were exposed in a controlled way rather than sudden exposure to very difficult situations. So additionally, the research indicated that timing of resilience intervention is crucial with developmental transitions such as moving to a new school or entering adolescence often being optimum moments to intervene. Especially when the people, certain stages of life, there's a transition happens in one's life, like moving to some new school. So things will change, will become much more difficult. In such time when resilient interventions were given, then they were found to be more effective because the necessity of such interventions were much more prominent in those transition phases. Some other researchers like Guwahati, Wright and colleagues observed that these strategies timings consideration could enhance and extend the positive effects of intervention, though timing depends on the intervention specific goals and nature. Okay. So timing of those interventions were also found to be very important in terms of to what extent these are effective and the positive outcomes are expected or not. The current wave of research, which is called the fourth wave of research on resilience, has continued to evolve from these last waves, progressing into what is now known as fourth and current wave of resilient research. This idea implies that all insights from the first three waves have been it's not that we have fully obtained all the research questions of the first, second or third waves. All these research are also continuing, then there is a new trend emerges, that is what we are talking about. Instead, it reflects ongoing research driven by both necessity and shifts that are necessary to address with the new findings and so on, with enhanced research methods and technologies. This advancement include improved techniques for measuring genes and brain functions, the development of new animal models for studying behaviors, introduction of innovative statistical method. All this development has happened and that led to more refined and higher order researches, maybe researches in the biological factors in resilience and so on are also coming up in the fourth wave. So Musten and other people also argued that the fourth wave of resilience research has the potential to offer deeper understanding across multiple levels. Now most of the present research or the fourth wave research focuses on how resilience is influenced by multiple levels, factors in the multiple levels, and they try to integrate all these things. So Musten emphasize, this researcher emphasized, he is one of the prominent researcher in resilience. He emphasized that this wave should not only build upon but also integrate research and theories that were development in all the three waves. A key aspect of this wave is recognizing resilience as a multidimensional phenomenon. So that's one of the main things. Now resilience is looked as a multidimensional phenomenon. You have to look at different factors in the different settings. So it is now understood that resilience operates across various systems and involves interaction between all these systems. So we cannot understand resilience just based on person. Example of how resilience is understood as a multidimensional phenomena. For example, in case of a child, resilience is influenced by multiple levels such as the child himself or herself, whatever the factors present, factors in the family, factors in the school, factors in the community. So this is an example where resilience is understood from multidimensional factors. Meso-level system like school and sports clubs can be further expanded to include other relevant organizations and groups specific to the child, whatever that influences child. Certain levels such as the individual can be further dissected, for instance, examining contribution of genes versus environment to resilience. All these diverse factors can be looked at in order to understand holistically the influence of factors at the multidimensional level, how all this contributes to resilience. In the multidimensional level, research also may focus on interaction between all these interconnected systems and so on. The thing is, with each wave, the research is becoming more complex in terms of taking factors from different systems. A researcher also noted that much of the recent research in the fourth wave of resilience studies has concentrated on biological and neuroscientific underpinning. A lot of these modern researches or today's research also focus on biological and neuroscientific factors for resilience, how to understand resilience from the brain factors and the other neurological and biological factors. Examples of this research include investigation into gene-environment interactions, the theory of differential susceptibility, interventional design to regulate maladaptive system in individuals, and integrative models of resilience and so on. So these are some of the examples of the kind of research that is going on in today's wave of research. So this topic, while not exhaustive, highlights the resilience as increasingly understood from both as an interactive and dynamic process. Some of the researchers also suggest that future research should focus on the dynamic process involved in successful adaptation to adversity. They advocate for the use of prospective longitudinal studies and other things also to better understand this. So these are some of the foundational waves of research and the patterns of research, content of research we have discussed. Now let us look at some of the classic studies that were conducted, few studies in the context of resilience, which will give us a brief sense of the important findings that we can understand from resilience research. One of the important classic research was a longitudinal study on high-risk children by Warner and Smith in 1992. They began this study in 1955 actually, following a multiracial group of children in a community over a 30-year period. So it was a longitudinal study. They were looking at a group of children over a 30-year period, focusing on those considered high risk due to significant environmental challenge. Now these children were facing a lot of difficult environmental challenges, and they were trying to identify the factors for resilience. Out of approximately 700 children, so this research can be started actually in the first wave of research. Out of approximate 700 children that they were studying, around 200 were classified as high risk due to factors like perinatal stress, poverty, daily instability, and severe parental mental health issues. So out of the 700 children, 200 were the high risk environment they were brought up, where the environment was full of challenges and difficulties like daily instability, severe parental mental health issues, poverty was there, and so on. Warner found that 72 of these high risk children, 72 out of these 200, actually demonstrated resilience and were thriving despite these adversities. 72 children out of these 200 were actually, despite all these problems in their life, they were actually thriving, and they are showing all the qualities of resilience in terms of successfully coping with these situations. They found these resilient children showed certain qualities such as they were showing more social responsibility, they are showing much more adaptability, they were flexible in terms of adapting to the situation, showing much more tolerance. They were very achievement oriented, they were trying to focus on what to achieve in their life. They were also effective communication skills they had, and they also had very positive self-esteem. They are having a very positive attitude about themselves, so their self-esteem was positive. These were some of the factors they found, children actually who thrive and who are showing resilience despite all these difficulties. Additionally, Warner highlighted the importance of obviously supportive caregiving environment, both within the family and the broader community. What kind of support system were also playing very important role as key contributors to the children's ability to overcome their adversity. So, apart from their characteristics, there were certain factors in the family and the environment that were also protective factors. The next research was Michael Reuter's resilience study. The British psychiatrist Michael Reuter conducted influential epidemiological study in the late 70s and 80s, focusing on resilience among youth in inner city London and on the Isle of Wight. So they were focusing on again a group of youth in London, and they were studying them, this particular group of young individuals. So his research revealed that approximately 1/4 of the children he was studying were resilient despite experiencing multiple risk factors. He also found among this group of children about 1/4 of them were showing the highly resilient quality despite they were facing multiple challenges and risk factors in their environment. So Reuter identified several qualities that appear to support resilience in these children. These qualities include easy temperament in terms of their mood and emotional experiences. Being female also they found, I think female were showing more resilience as compared to males. A positive schools climate, what kind of school they are going on. Self-mastery, a sense of control over one's life. That sense of self-mastery was also was a very important predictor. Self-efficacy, the confidence in their own ability. Their planning skills, a close supportive relationship with an adult were all contributing factor in terms of enhancing resilience. Another study was done by Norman Germezi, Minnesota Risk Research Project. Norman Germezi in 1991 and his colleagues included Marston and Chalugan in 1984 conducted the Minnesota Risk Research Project, which explored the impact of growing up with schizophrenic parents from 1971 to 1982. So again, it was a longitudinal study, and they're looking at the children who had parents with schizophrenia disorder, or mental disorder, and they were trying to focus on how these children of schizophrenic parents cope with potential risk, particularly examining dysfunction in intentional and information processing system. Since this is highly challenging environment for these children, when your parent is having a serious psychological disorder, they are looking at these children, how they cope with this situation. Germezi found that most of these children did not develop any maladaptive adults or problems. Instead, they grew up to become competent, warm and functional individuals. They found most of these children actually were not becoming, they did not grow up to become maladaptive adults or problematic adults. In fact, most of them actually grew up to be competent, warm and functional individuals despite these challenges from the parents' behavior and so on. He identified several criteria for resilience. So if they fulfill these criteria, they can be called as resilient, and most of them actually fulfilled them. These criteria were effectiveness in work, play and love, high expectations for oneself, positive outlook, strong self-esteem, internal locus of control, self-discipline, good problem-solving skills, critical thinking abilities, sense of humor, and so on. And they found a lot of these children actually can be considered as resilient individuals. The triad of resilience, Germezi's model of resilience is also called as triad of resiliency, which included 3 components from this model he found. One is obviously the personal disposition, what kind of personal characteristics you have, inherent trait that help individual to navigate challenges, so that will contribute to one's resilience. Second is supportive family environment, a nurturing home environment that provides emotional and practical support. So they also found that home environment plays very important role. Although in this research context, their parents are having psychological disorder, but beyond that, there is an environmental support system. To what extent that supports them is also important. The external support system is also important, where social and community support structure outside the family, how it supports also plays very important role. So for resilience, these three important factors are very important: personal disposition, supportive family environment, and external support system beyond family. All these three factors actually contributes to resiliency. Another research by Peter Benson, Search Institute study on developmental assets. Under the direction of Peter Benson, the Search Institute conducted a large-scale surveys between 1990 and 1995, surveying over 350,000 6 to 12 grade children or students across about 600 communities. So it was a very large-scale survey done on 6 to 12 grade students across 600 communities from 1990 to 1995. The goal was to identify the developmental assets that contribute to youth thriving in life. What factors contribute to the flourishing in their life or thriving in their life? Initially, the institute identified 30 key assets, later expanded to 40 after further research. So that research led to a creation of a list of factors which can be considered as an assets for development. We will not talk about all these factors, but they included factors like external and internal youth assets. The developmental assets identified were grouped into two categories: external and internal assets. Some assets were related to external environment, some assets were related to the internal personality factors. Here are some of the examples. External assets include support, positive relationship with family, adults. All these things are very important. Empowerment, the ability to value oneself and feel empowered in a situation. Boundaries and expectations, knowing what is expected and having clear boundaries. Constructive use of time, engaging in productive and positive activities. These were some of the external factors which contributed to resilience. Some of the internal assets included educational commitment, achieving motivation and drive for success. Positive values, caring, honesty, responsibility and integrity. Social competencies, skills for effective communication and interpersonal relationship. Positive identity, self-esteem, sense of purpose, internal control. So these are all factors they found were related to the resiliency or development of resilience. So in other comprehensive review of literature, people like Bernard also concluded that significant portion of high-risk children, at least 50% of them, and often closer to 70%, grow up to become successful adults. So it's not that many times this difficult situation actually makes people resilient. So they found about 50 to 70% of such high risk children actually grow up to become successful adults. Not only meeting social indicators of success, but also developing confident, competent and caring individuals. So it's not necessary that all the time this adversity sometimes propels people to become resilient. This finding highlights the powerful role that developmental assets play in fostering resilience and positive outcome. So if those are some of these assets that we discussed from the findings, if they are present, they facilitate resilience in much better way. And those people who actually experience high resilience, actually a lot of these factors are present in their life. So these are some of the things about resilience. So in this lecture, we defined resilience and tried to see some of the waves of research, patterns of research that emerge historically, and then we looked at some of the classic studies. With this, I stop here. Thank you.